Hello, this is Charles E. Brown and welcome back to the Complete JavaScript for Developers course. In this video, we are going to talk about adding HTML elements with JavaScript. This is a process that requires several steps, so let's open Visual Studio Code and get started. Let's begin by creating a new website. I'm going to call this one Add Element. And then once the website or folder is created, I'm going to add an index.html file. Now I'm just going to give this HTML file a basic skeletal structure. So I'm going to start off with the doc type. I'm going to build my root element. I'll give it the two sub-elements of head and then the one of body. And that's it. That's all I'm going to add into this HTML document. Once we have that completed, I'm going to go ahead and create a JavaScript file. I'm just going to call this one add.js. You can call it whatever you want. And finally, I'm going to go ahead over to just before the closing of that HTML element, and I'm going to add my script element, and of course give it the source. I'll do Control Spacebar and do my add.js, and then complete that element. And we're all set. We have our basic structure set up. The process of adding an HTML element using JavaScript is a three-step process. You first have to use the createElement method to define the element you want to create. You then add whatever content you need to the element, and finally, you add the finished element to the location of your choice using the appendChild method. Well, let's see a simple example. I'm going to go over to my JavaScript file, and I'm going to start off by setting a variable. And you can call the variable whatever you want. I'll call this one P1. And I'm going to make that equal to the document dot, and I'm going to call the createElement method. Now, in the parentheses as a parameter, I'm going to put the name of the element I want to create as a string. In this case, I'm just going to do a P element, but it could just as easily be a div or an ordered list, an unordered list, or whichever element you want. The next thing we have to do is give our element some meaningful content. So I'm going to say P1, and I'm going to call up once again text content. And you notice that text content can be used both to read text in an element and to write text in an element. So I'm going to make that equal to a string, and you can put whatever you want into here. I'm going to say this was created with JavaScript. Okay, and the final step is we have to place it, and we're going to call up an old friend right here, and that's going to be the query selector. Now what we're doing is we're telling the query selector at this point to find the body tag. And then I'm going to say dot appendChild. So we're saying make it a child of the body tag, and we're going to append P1 into it. Now notice that once again we're using that query selector method to specify where we want the paragraph added. And theoretically, you do not need the query selector in a simple situation like this. However, it is a good habit to get into for consistency when you get into a more complex scenario. Well, let's give this a quick test using Live Server. I'm going to make sure I'm saved, which I am here. I'm going to come down and I'm going to do live-server, and I'm going to call up the website add element. Watch your spelling here and casing, and press the return key, And there we could see the browser opened up, the website activated, and there's the paragraph that we just added into the index.html document. Now I can add a second paragraph the same way. I can come over if I wanted to. Let's say come down a couple lines, and I'll call this one, let's say P2. And once again, I'm going to use exactly the same techniques. I'm going to use document.createElement. And once again, I'm going to create a P element. I'm going to say P2.textContent equals, and I'll just do something like, this is the second paragraph. Then come down, and once again, I'm going to do a document.querySelector. And I'm going to search for body. I'm going to do append child. And this time I'm going to tell it to append P2. And if I come back to my browser should have updated, and there it is, it updated with the second paragraph. Notice that the append child always adds to the last element. So I didn't need to say put it after the P1 paragraph element that we created. What I said here was just append child, and it added it in right at the end. We also have the ability to add attributes to the elements we create with the Setattribute method. As you'll see in a bit, this can be an important feature. I'm going to go ahead and return back over to my JavaScript code, and anywhere you can go ahead and add a blank line, and I'm going to say P1, and I'm going to call this Setattribute method. Now the Setattribute method is going to take two strings. The first one is going to be the name of the attribute that you want to assign. In this case, I'm going to assign ID, but it could just as easily be source or class or any one of the other attributes. I'm going to give it a comma, and then the value I want to assign to that attribute. In this case, I'm going to say para1. So what I just did, I just gave this paragraph element, which we call P1, an ID attribute of para1. I'm going to do the same with the second paragraph, so I'm going to do P2.setAttribute. And once again, I'm going to give that an ID element, and I'm going to call this one para2. Now, you can use the Setattribute to set any attributes for any element you add, and I strongly recommend that when working with JavaScript, you give each element you add an ID. You'll see why in a moment. Let's say you wanted to add an H1 tag before the first paragraph, which now has the ID of para1. There is a relatively new method in JavaScript called before, which replaces the older insert before method. Let's give something a try. I'm going to come down and add a couple blank lines, and I'm going to create a new element. I'm going to call this one, let's call it heading. I'm going to make that equal to document.createElement. And this time, instead of a P element, we're going to define an H1 element. I'm going to give it some content now, where I'm going to do heading.textContent, and I'm going to make that equal to, this is a new heading. Okay, I'm also going to then do heading.setAttribute, and once again I'm going to set the ID attribute, and I'm going to call this one, heading1. But now I'm going to do like I did before. I'm going to do the document.query selector. There it is. But this time, instead of looking for a specific tag, I'm going to look for an ID. And remember from the last video that an ID always begins with the pound symbol. And this time, I'm going to do para1. And afterwards, I'm going to do a dot, but instead of doing the append child, I'm going to do the before method. And this is a relatively new method. And inside of there, I am going to put in heading. So just to kind of recap a little bit, this is why the IDs are important, because it helps you select where you want to put things. So here we created the new H1 element. We added content, we added an attribute, an ID attribute, and then we told the query selector not to look for a specific tag, but to look for an ID, and then before, place the heading. So if I go ahead and save, come back to our browser, we can see that that was placed exactly where we wanted it. Now, let's say we wanted the heading to appear in between the two paragraphs. All we have to do is change the word before to after, and it will appear after the paragraph. In fact, let's go ahead and give that a try. I'm going back to my code, and instead of having the word before, I'm going to add the word after. Go ahead and save. And if I now look at our browser, we could see it was placed after the paragraph element with the para1 ID. Now, if you've done previous JavaScript programming in the DOM, you would have to agree that this greatly simplifies a lot and reduces the amount of code needed to add elements to the DOM. All right, here's a bit of a mini challenge. Start a new website called Challenge 2. Create the shell index.html and the JavaScript file. Then, programmatically using JavaScript, give the HTML document an H1 element and 5 P elements with content of your choice. But be sure to use the word second in a couple of the paragraphs. Finally, search through the paragraphs, and any that has the text second in it, make the text blue. Okay, stop the video and let's see how you do. Okay, how'd you make out? There's several different ways you could have approached this, but let's take a look at one way. I'm going to start off by closing my browser. I'm going to go back over to Visual Studio Code, and let's make sure that Live Server is shut down. And I'll just clear my terminal. Okay, and what I'm going to do is then I'm going to come over and I'm going to create a new website. And as I said, we're going to call this one Challenge 2. And within that, I'm going to create the index.html. Now I'm going to give the index.html just a basic structure like we did before. So I'm going to start off with the doc type. HTML, and then just build a basic structure. HTML, head, and finally the body element. Whoops. Hopefully spelt right. And go ahead and save. Next thing I'm going to want to do is I want to build my JavaScript file, and I'll call this challenge.js. And finally, I'm going to come back to my index.html. I'm going to go just before the closing root element or the closing HTML element, put in my script, use my source attribute, and I'm going to link that up with challenge.js. And we have our basic structure all set up. Okay, now that we have the basic structure set up, let's return to the JavaScript file and start putting in our content. Now the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create an h1 element. So I'll say let, and I'll call this heading. You can call it whatever you want, equals document dot create element. And the one we're going to create here is going to be an h1 element. And then I'm going to do heading dot, and we'll add some meaningful content to it using the text content property, equals, and I'm going to just say something like, this is the result of the challenge. You can put whatever text you want into there. I'm going to do heading dot, and I'm going to set the attribute to give it an ID. Remember I said it's a good idea to do for all the elements that you add in. Good habit to get into. And I'll call this one head1. And then I'm going to go ahead and add it in. And I'm going to do that via the document dot query selector. And I'm going to add it as a child to the body. I'm going to do dot append child. And I'm going to add into there, whoops, I didn't mean to do that as text on there. It's a variable, heading. And it's probably not a bad idea to give it a test at this point, just to make sure that everything is working all right. So I'm going to come down to live-server, and we're going to open up challenge 2. And we see that everything is working fine. There's the heading 1 that we just added. And we'll keep live server running and keep coming back to the browser as we add more content to it. Okay, let's return back over to our JavaScript code. And I'm going to add a couple blank lines down. And we're going to do let, and I'll call our first paragraph P1. And I'm going to make that equal to document dot create element. And this is going to be a P element. Okay. Then I'm going to do a P1 dot text content, and I'm going to say equals, this is the first paragraph. Then I'm going to do a P1 dot set attribute. And once again, I'm going to give this an ID attribute, and I'm going to call it, let's call it para1. You can call it whatever you want. And then again, I'm going to do the document dot query selector body. Now, I could have done one of two different things here. I could have done body and the append child, which I am doing here, but I also could have done the ID of heading and then use after. Either one would have worked fine, and if you did either, that's fine done. That's fine on here. So I'm going to do append child. Remember, append child adds things sequentially to the end, so either one would have worked the same way. P1. And once again, I'm going to give this a fast save just to make sure everything is working all right. Go back, and there you can see it's been added in just fine. All right, let's go ahead and return back over to our JavaScript code. And from here on in, if you're really careful, we can do some copying and pasting. So I'm going to grab all of these lines right here, and I'm going to copy down a couple lines and paste. And what I'm going to do is just make some changes when I paste. So this is going to be P2. Okay, the text content, I'm going to say this is the second paragraph. Okay, I'm going to set the ID to para2, and I'm going to append child P2 here. Whoops, I forgot to change these variables too here. That should be P2 and P2 there. Okay, that should work. and then I'll come down, do the same thing for 3, and again I'll make this P3. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, I'll make that P3. Okay, and then I'll change that to 3. I'll say this is the 3rd paragraph. I'll make that P3, and then we're going to come down and append child P3. Okay, come down, do the same for 4. Okay, do the same for 4. I'll do a P4. I'll say this is the 4th paragraph. P4. And then finally I'm going to come down and append child P4. And finally I'm going to do the 5th one. I make that P5. And whoopsie, and I forgot on these other two, I forgot to change the ID here. Okay, this is what you have to be careful about copying and pasting. You can make mistakes with it sometimes. So that's going to be P5. And we're going to change the text here. Okay, I'm going to say this is the 2nd paragraph with 2nd in it. And the reason for that is we want 2 of them that have the word 2nd in it. I'm going to make that P5. I'm going to go and change that ID to 5. Okay, and I'm going to append P5. Okay, let's go ahead and save, and let's take a quick look in the browser, make sure everything worked all right, and everything seemed to work fine up to this point. Okay, the last thing I wanted you to do was search through all the paragraphs, or the paragraph elements, I should say, and look for any where the text content has the word 2nd in it, and make that text blue. So we're going to go ahead and return back over to our code. There we go. And I'll put a couple of blank lines in. And I'm going to set a new variable. I'm going to call it my selection, or whatever you want to call it, equals document dot. Instead of using query selector now, since we're going to be doing a search through multiple paragraph elements, we're going to have to do query selector all. Okay, and we're going to be searching through the P elements. So we have that. And then as soon as you do query selector all, as you know, you probably want to use a for each loop. So I'm going to do my selection dot for each. And we've gone through the syntax on this already. I'm going to use para as my parameter, but you can use whatever name you want there, and then build the block. And then I'm going to build a conditional statement. I'm going to say if para dot, and I'm going to use the property text content, and then call the function includes, and we're going to look for the string 2nd, and then build our block after that. I'm going to say para dot style dot color equals, and I'm using blue, you can use whatever color you want actually. Okay, I think we're all set. We're going to go ahead and save, go back to my browser, and we could see that the 2 paragraphs that have the word 2nd in it are now blue. Hope you made out well with this. As you can see, there's a set routine you can follow with a lot of these, a set sequence of events that you can use, and you pretty well repeat that each time you're working with the DOM with JavaScript. Now in the next video, we're going to talk about how the user can interact with JavaScript code. See you there.